of Men and Dragons, Chapter 31, by DrBlackJack21. Shahar was in the middle of her daily tour of the camp. It was as uneventful as usual, so she allowed her mind to wander a little as she walked. Day by day, it always seemed like so little happened, but looking back now, she couldn't help but think of all that had changed since Jack had fallen into his coma. They had 4 buildings up now. A billet for the workers, a woodworking hall, a smithy, and a warehouse. At the moment, the buildings were mostly empty, but Angela insisted they build them, with the growth of the settlement in mind. The billet was designed to sleep 2 to a room comfortably, but everyone currently had private rooms with at least a room or 2 between each worker. They were all situated around a large common room, which had a good-sized fire pit designed for cooking and storytelling. The reluctant worker had left as soon as the snow melted. Lonthal escorted him back to the village safely, made a report, and returned to continue in his role as the eyes and ears of the village, while also supplying plenty of fresh meat to earn his keep. The woodworkers' hall could comfortably fit double what it currently housed with no further additions, but a portion of the building was also set aside to store tools and materials. If they were to put up another building nearby for storage, they could easily fit even more workers. Fayen had made sure all the stations were built to perfection. She'd taken her charges to task on more than one occasion when she found their work subpar. Shahar honestly couldn't tell the difference between the quality work and the rejected attempts, but Angela had told her, "That's what delegating is all about. You get the best person for the job, put them in charge, then let them do their job. If you have the quality workers, a manager's job is more about seeing to it that their needs are met than babysitting." The smithy felt empty since only one metal worker was present. For want of company, Telron often spent his days working in the woodworkers' hall. He and the woodworkers had gotten to know each other pretty well over the last few weeks. While the usual rivalry between woodworkers and smiths was present, it was mostly limited to good-natured fun in their small group. However, if something needed any serious work done, Telron was more than happy to utilize the new facilities. The smelters were located outdoors, with a loose tent-like covering overhead, but they had a few good forges on the inside and an anvil made out of wrought iron, with a steel face. Most of the anvils back at the village were currently made out of bronze, so this was a significant improvement. His eyes had practically leapt out of his skull when Emerald told him of her plans for several such anvils, though they still only had the one for the time being. It had taken Emerald and Angela a bit of work to refit the mining suit for Emerald to use, and even then, the girl had been timid in its use at first. But as she'd grown more and more accustomed to it, the work also went smoother, though she still wasn't as fast as Jack had been. Angela said it had something to do with the suit requiring sustained exertion more than raw strength, probably because it had been designed with humans in mind. Still, they were mining iron ore much faster than any Argoon would typically have been able to. Shahar smiled to herself as she thought of Emerald. The girl's intelligence, courage, timidness, and natural beauty had endeared her to the entire camp, and had created a bit of rivalry between the only 2 boys of appropriate age. Telron and Lonthal were both falling over themselves to get Emerald's attention, though, as far as Shahar was aware, things hadn't progressed much past that point. They'd all been too busy, and the boys feared Shahar's or Fayen's wrath if they were found slacking. So it was mostly limited to boasting around the campfire and trying to be the first to think of a new compliment for Emerald each day. As Shahar exited the smithy, Fayen was waiting to address the new concern for the day. The old woodworker's arms were crossed in her typical stoic manner, though Shahar knew her well enough by now to know that there was no hostility in her stance, and any irritation she radiated was directed at whatever got in the way of her work, rather than any nearby person. Her voice was, as always, just as gravelly and stoic as her stance.
"Ground's too frozen to keep digging the palisade. However, we got the post for the northern guard tower sunk, so we could keep working on that. Or we could get started shaping the wood for the guardhouse that'll go near the gate. Your call."
Shahar thought for a moment before turning back to the master woodworker.
"The guard tower is more important to get up quickly. If the guardhouse isn't up come spring, the guard will have to set up a temporary station near the gate."
Fayen nodded her understanding.
"Makes sense. Give me a bit. I'll let you know what we'll need in order to finish it up.
Following that, Fan was off to seek out Emerald so they could take another look at the plans the girl and the dragon had drawn up together. Shahar was pretty sure more wood was near the top of the list. They already had some shaped lumber ready to go, but it was best to split the woodworkers into 2 teams, one prepping the new wood and the other doing the construction. Besides, that meant Shahar got to use the chainsaw again. Once again, she wasn't quite as fast as Jack had been, since its use also seemed to require endurance rather than brawn. But she could definitely understand why Jack had always seemed to have so much fun while he used it. Eventually, her arms would feel ready to drop, and it wasn't as much fun anymore, but that first tree was always a rush. She smiled sadly to herself, imagining the wild grin Jack had plastered on his face the first time he showed her the chainsaw at work. With a last look at the camp, Shahar's smile turned from sad to content. Everyone was where they should be, and the work was progressing smoothly. Well, one person was missing, but Shahar knew Emerald and Fayen were more than up to the task of keeping the missing individual on task. Emerald was walking out of the cave with the rolled-up plans for the guard tower. Sure enough, Lonthal was waiting for her near the entrance of the cave. He looked at her with his large, innocent eyes before speaking.
Want me to carry those for you?
Emerald looked at him with her head tilted to one side as she kept walking.
As always, I appreciate the offer, but I'm perfectly capable of carrying some parchment that barely weighs a couple of pounds. Besides, don't you have some hunting to do?
Lonthal shook his head.
Nah, we've got enough meat stored up that we can probably eat from our reserves for a few days before I go out again. We wouldn't want unused meat spoiling. Today I'm supposed to be working on digging out the well some more, though I don't know why you need it to be so large.
Emerald shifted her head and picked up her pace a little, forcing Lonthal to adjust his own speed to keep up as she spoke.
I told you, we're not building this camp to accommodate the people here now, or even a couple of months from now. We're designing it to accommodate the number of people who might be here a year from now. If your village is anything like my own, it's laid out in an ever-increasing sprawl that slowly expands as more people need more housing. What if we planned on the need to expand from the beginning? What if we organized everything with an eventual larger population in mind? That's what we're trying to do, here and now.
Lonthal nodded his understanding. Once he'd adjusted his speed, he was able to keep up with Emerald due to his long stride, but he was still having to breathe a little heavier to speak while walking at this pace. Few men in the village could keep up with Lonthal's pace, and he wondered where a noble like Emerald had gotten the endurance to set this kind of pace. Still, he was determined to show as little discomfort as he could while he spoke.
You make a good point, but it seems like it would just be easier to dig a second well when we need one. We'd already be done by now if this were a normal well.
Emerald came to a halt as she shifted the scrolls to one arm so she could open the door to the woodworkers' hall. She was about to reply when Fayen's familiar gravelly voice cut out from behind the two of them.
I'm curious, boy. How do you plan on impressing the girl by complaining about the well she designed, rather than making it a reality, the way Telron is doing right now?
Lonthal froze mid-step, and Emerald could practically hear the thoughts running through his head. His motivation had simply been to talk with Emerald a little longer. He hadn't meant to diminish Emerald's design. Now he had to decide between taking the time to defend his intentions or going and getting to work, so Telron didn't get all the credit. He was caught in what Angela had once described as a catch-22. It was a phrase named after a famous human book, and it meant that there was no right answer. Finally, with a rueful smile, Lonthal bowed his head in apology to Fayen.
You're right. I'm sorry. I'll go to work right now.
Turning to Emerald, he added,
I can't wait to see what you make for lunch. I'm sure I'll work up quite the appetite making your vision a reality.
With a wave, he ran off. Emerald turned to Fayen with a raised eye-ridge.
I wish you wouldn't give him such a hard time. Lonthal has been working as hard as anyone else here.
Fayen tilted her own head as she watched the boy leave.
He's a good kid. With a bit of luck, he might even turn out to be a good man. Right now, he's still a little too naive, and sometimes he needs a bit of a kick in the rear to get moving in the right direction. Despite taking the lives of so many animals, he still doesn't realize how cruel and uncaring the world we live in can be, and how quickly things can go wrong if we aren't prepared.
Emerald grew quiet as Fayen's words sunk in. She knew what the woman meant. There was a lesson with which Emerald was all too familiar with. Some days, it was all she could do to put a smile on her face when going out to face the same world that had taken both her father and Jack from her. Then she remembered something Jack had once told her when she asked how he dealt with his own loss years ago. You have to set goals for yourself. Not something far-fetched or obscure like, I want to be wealthy or I want to be happy. No, instead you set realistic, achievable goals. For instance, when I got here, I needed to get a local guide. Check. I needed to get to the village and establish a rapport with the people. Check. I needed a sled and then a wagon. Check. Check. Emerald had nodded, but felt like he was asking the impossible. However, Jack wasn't done. Some days, the bad days, that could be too big a goal to handle. Instead, you set smaller goals just to keep you moving. Something like, I'm going to get out of bed and take a shower, or I'm going to clean my room, etc. Then there are terrible days, days where an hour away is just too far. Those days your goals can be as simple as, I'm going to take another step, or I'm going to sit up. The key is to keep moving forward. No matter how slow or small your progress is, as long as you move forward, you're moving in the right direction. Emerald nodded her head to the Jack in her mind and pushed open the door to the woodworkers' hall. At the memory of Jack and his comforting smile, her own smile had returned, and she got started on her next goal.
Okay, I've got the plans for the guard towers right here. Let's get them laid out on the table and figure out what our first step should be.
Fayen followed the younger girl inside. At first, she'd just been humoring the girl when she presented the plans for the first building after Emerald had taken over where Jack had left off. However, Fayen had quickly discovered the girl really knew what she was talking about and listened intently as she described what she wanted. Looking at the plans, Fayen offered a few recommendations or corrections based on her own expertise, and Emerald incorporated them into her plans without hesitation. Fayen couldn't help but appreciate how nice it was to work with someone who knew what they wanted, while also respecting an expert's advice. In her own experience, those two things never existed in the same job at the same time. Initially, Fayen had only come out here to get things started in the camp and make sure her workers were safe. But between the people running the place and how comfortable the living conditions were, she was beginning to think of making the move permanent. Angela rode along with Shahar and Emerald as they worked throughout the day. She also kept an eye on the surrounding wildlife and weather, focusing on anything else that could further threaten her family. All this was done while a small portion of her attention remained focused on Jack. She'd cataloged every twitch, murmur, and even changes in breathing and heart rate. The changes were all subtle, but it was enough to indicate to her that some activity was going on in his mind, and she held on to the hope that gave her with the same way a drowning man might hold on to a life preserver tossed his way. She tried never to let on to the girls how scared she was of losing Jack. They had more than enough worries of their own, and she could tell they used her hopeful demeanor as a source of strength. She hadn't really explained how bad Jack's coma was, but she could tell as time went on they were starting to suspect the truth. Based on his lack of response to stimuli after the first 24 hours, Jack's likelihood of waking up dropped to something like 13%. As the days passed and he remained unresponsive, his odds continued to fall. Most coma patients would either wake up in under 5 weeks or stay asleep for the rest of their lives. Every day dragged on closer to that deadline, and Jack remained unresponsive. Angela ran through the tests again, just like she did twice every day. First, she tested for any response to verbal stimulation. "How are you doing today, Jack? Can you hear me? If so, could you open your eyes?" No response. Second, using a robotic arm set up next to his bed, she applied pressure to the nail on his index finger for 10 seconds, enough to be described as an uncomfortable pressure, but not enough to do any damage. 1, 2, 3. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. No response. Third, she applied the trapezius pinch. It is a pinch applied next to the patient's neck to stimulate pain, but isn't enough to cause any real damage. She squeezed for 10 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Jack's elbow slowly bent, and his arm came across his body. Angela was so stunned she forgot to release her grip for 1/10 of a second. That was clearly abnormal flexation, but still a response to pain. That made his score 5 out of a possible 15. It was still a low score, but it was also the highest score he'd scored since he was first brought in by Embryl. As Jack continued walking along the road in the middle of nowhere, he heard Angela's usual question. Sure, she talked to him throughout the day, but every so often she went through the same pattern of questions. Jack tried to shout out his responses, but nothing seemed to penetrate the gloom of the place he found himself in. But this time, shortly after the usual questions of his shouted response, his shoulder started hurting. Jack's arm shot up to his shoulder as he swore under his breath. That's when he heard Angela's surprised voice. You felt that? Jack, can you hear me? If you can, you better get your butt back here. We're running out of time. Jack looked down the road, stretching out in front of him, and picked up his pace a little. He still had a long way to go, but he finally felt like he was making progress.